We're going to talk about energy markets, the California energy crisis, and the smart grid. So we want to keep these questions in mind as we go through the process. We're looking at the transmission organizations, for instance, the Western grid. All of this area is synchronized together on the same 60 hertz, and all of this area as well. When power needs to pass from one region to another, it has to go through a DC transducer or some other way so that the electricity remains in sync with its own area. We look at California, and this yellow area is controlled by the California Independent Systems Operator. Casio, the independent system operator, what are they responsible for? They're responsible for making sure that load is always met, or that the supply of electricity meets the demand of the consumer. And so first of all, they have to make sure they have enough generation capacity at the ready. Furthermore, that power will not help all the people if it can't get to them. So they have to make sure none of the lines are overloaded. That is, when the current gets too big, you have too much resistive loss and heat that will cause the lines to sag. We don't let that happen. The supply of electrical power also has to be robust, meaning if you lose one generator or one transmission line, you'll still be able to operate. And lastly, that we have to be stable through disruptions. So here are the energy lines, and you can see, for instance, if we have a ready supply of wind energy here, for instance, and we need to get it to San Francisco, we'll have a problem if we have to go through a line that's already loaded. So how do we maintain stability? So for short disruptions like a broken line or a lightning strike, we have electronic means to maintain stability. However, when the load increases, we can respond with load followers. That is, we can increase the amount of natural gas we have going into a Brayton cycle or increase the amount of water coming through a turbine in response to either the frequency dropping or the voltage dropping due to increased load. Once the capacity of all the generating facilities is saturated, we need to turn on more facilities. And that's called dispatching, when you turn them on. And so this is a much slower process because sometimes you have to start the ignition process up again. And so this is a situation when in the evening, in the summer times, we start up just for a short hour, we dispatch the less efficient single cycle electrical generation facilities. In order to meet demand over long periods of time with projected increased consumption because of population growth, for instance, we have to build new facilities. This requires significant capital cost and a lot of planning, and it's a many-year, unbelievably slow process. It can be as much as 15 years, especially for a nuclear facility. So what about demand response? How about if we were able to meet load not by increasing the supply, but by making the consumer aware of an increased price, for instance, and have the demand drop? That's called demand response, or demand side management, as opposed to supply side management, which we've talked to up until now. The load factor is very important in determining the cost of electricity. Your peak demand determines how much you have to pay to build a facility, because you need enough generation capability to meet your peak demand. Your average demand is the amount of electricity you sell, which is your revenue. So we would like this ratio to be as big as possible, as close to 1 as possible. The load factor increases with the size, the number of consumers, and the diversity. Because imagine that, even for my small electrical needs, I need 2,000 watts at one point, for instance, when I run my microwave oven. So that would mean I need to have 2,000 watts of capacity if it were just for me, even though I use on average 100 watts. However, if we load into 35 million people, it's very unlikely that all these different people are going to start their microwave ovens at the same time. That will increase your load factor. So this is why transmission systems tend to be very large And it's good for us to remember that generation only accounts for slightly less than half of the cost of electricity, the rest being long-distance transmission and the distribution of electricity to the different users. We keep in mind the California energy curve, that at nighttime the consumption can drop below 20 gigawatts, but during the summer, especially in the evening when the air conditioner load is high, the demand can go up over 40 gigawatts, and that our capacity to produce electricity is only about 42 gigawatts. This graph correlates the demand in megawatts to the capacity factor and the cost. We see here that this is 20,000 megawatts or 20 gigawatts. So at less than 18 gigawatts, we need that all the time. However, something like 30 gigawatts, we need that only about 20% of the time. And if we look at this curve, this correlates that capacity factor with the cost of electricity. We see that the cost is in dollars per megawatt hour. So you can take this number and divide by 10 and you get cents per kilowatt hour. And so we see that the facilities we use all the time cost about 4 cents a kilowatt hour. This is called the marginal cost of electricity. This is the cost of the last facility that you dispatched. Nuclear and coal are baseload. They're being used all the time, 100%. They're down around less than 10,000 megawatts, 10 gigawatts. So what this means is 28 gigawatts. We only need that about 50% of the time, that or more, 50% of the time. And so the cost of that facility, that natural gas combined cycle facility, the last one we turn on when we need 20 gigawatts, costs about 6 cents a kilowatt hour. Let's say demand increases to 40 gigawatts. We need that about 2% of the time. The capacity factor is about 2%. And so the cost is going to be right about here, or about 45 cents per kilowatt hour. However, if we wanted 43 gigawatts, that's less than 1% capacity factor. We almost never need that. That's the one that's turned on for 3 hours a year. And that cost is off the top of this graph, is more than $1 a kilowatt hour. And so you say, well, why do we care if it's only being used for 1 hour, 2 hours, and it's only one facility? Well, it turns out that we pay all of the facilities, all of the generating facilities, the marginal cost of electricity. Well, the natural gas combined cycle facilities that can run for 4 cents a kilowatt hour, they bid in at 4 cents a kilowatt hour. Now, they're being used all the time. However, the last peaker plant that we turn on that costs us $1 a kilowatt hour, we pay to everybody. Now, you might ask yourself, okay, that's a lot of money for the ratepayers. But you also might ask yourself, how do the facilities feel about this? They're making a huge amount of money. This natural gas facility that can produce electricity for 4 cents a kilowatt hour and is getting $1 a kilowatt hour. And that motivation ties very strongly into what happened with the California energy crisis. Let's look at some economics. This is a supply and demand curve. Here is the price of a commodity, and here is the amount. So this is a supply curve. Yes, as the price of a commodity goes up, the market will supply you with a larger and larger amount. However, the demand curve is the opposite. As the price goes up, the consumer will be likely to buy less and less. Where these two intersect is the equilibrium price of the market. Now, the demand might shift. It might increase. So, for instance, in the summer when it's hot and we turn on our air conditioners, so what's going to happen is we'll reach a new equilibrium point and a new price of electrical generation. Now, in this graph, the demand and the supply curves are both stiffer. And this means that you're going to have to raise the price quite a bit in order to get the demand to go down. This is, for instance, in gasoline. What we find is we've increased the price of gasoline by a factor of 3 over the past decade, and the reduction in use is very, very small. Now, when there is a shift in demand, we'll find a much larger increase in the price. This is how the electricity market curve might have looked in the late 1990s, where the demand is vertical. What this means is if you increase the price or decrease the price, people are going to want the same amount. This is what happens when the consumer doesn't pay for the increased cost or isn't aware of it. Both of those were the case before the California energy crisis. The consumer paid a flat rate of, in California, about 15 cents a kilowatt hour. Furthermore, they had no idea how much PG&E was paying the generation facilities for the electricity generated. Now, what's very dangerous is that this is not a realistic curve. In fact, the supply cannot increase forever. There's a point at which all the generators are on. And now we might be fine here, but if the demand shifts, we get to a point where supply cannot meet demand, and in that case, we have blackouts or brownouts. And this is what happened in 2001. These are the names of the organizations that played in with the California energy crisis. It's worth getting to know what they are. Let me just focus on the bottom here. The market. When we say the market, we mean the capitalistic market of supply and demand, whereby we can reach an equilibrium price. When we say the market is strong or the market is working, it means society is being served. It means we're reaching an equilibrium point where the consumer and the supplier are reasonably satisfied. Gaming is when a company can make money by not serving society, by somehow tricking society into getting money without breaking the law, or, as the case may be, without getting caught. Collusion is when different organizations cooperate to undermine society. This is what happened in 2001.